Wonder, what were you doing with yourself in the year 1990? Personally, I wasn't doing all that much. I was toddling about, going for naps, making a mess in my high chair. But some of you can probably remember the year 1990 a whole lot more clearly. And maybe for some of you, if you were to look back on the 33 years since 1990, you'd be amazed by how much has changed. I mean, you think about it, supermarkets, certainly where I grew up, were a pretty dull place in the early 90s. Some of the things that we take for granted today would have seemed to have been incredibly exotic in the early 90s. You just wouldn't have found them on the shelves of the different supermarkets. In 1990, if you had family living in another part of the world, well, there was no FaceTime, there was no WhatsApp, and the only way that you could actually see them was for somebody to physically get onto a plane, and so you didn't see them very often. I don't know if any of you went to quizzes in the 90s. Maybe sometimes. Do you remember what happened if you didn't know the answer? You didn't know the answer. Now, of course, you've got a computer in your pocket, and you can pull it out, and all it takes is a couple of taps, and you will know exactly what the capital of Bolivia is, or exactly how far it is to the planet Jupiter, or exactly what year Michelangelo was born, and it's as easy as that. The world has changed since 1990. In many ways, the world is a better place, in lots of ways. But there's also plenty of ways in which the world has changed for the worse. Marriage and family have changed. There are more people, more children in Ireland than ever before who are growing up without the security of two married parents. Divorce laws, they have changed marriage from what it's supposed to be, which is a lifelong commitment, and they've turned it into something like a phone contract. In fact, almost less stringent than a phone contract, because you can walk away from it for any reason whatsoever. Healthcare has changed. Or it's what we call healthcare. A baby can have his arms and his legs ripped off simply because he or she is regarded as an inconvenience. What does our society call that? Progress. Porn use has exploded. There are so many people who are chronically addicted to the videos they pull up on their phones. There are many, many marriages that have been ruined by it. There are many, many teenage girls who have been pressured into recreating what their partners have seen on the screen. And there's things I haven't even mentioned. I haven't even mentioned the sheer insanity of gender identity policy. I haven't mentioned the way gambling companies have sunk their claws into sport. The world, in many ways, has changed for the worse. Now look, I'm not looking to be a cranky old man. I'm not looking to be one of these people who says, well, you know what, everything was so much better back in the good old days. I think most of what I've said, apart from probably the transgender stuff, most of that was around in the early 1990s. It's just that in the last 33 years, we've driven further down the road. And so the question is, given that the world has changed so much since 1990, what does God expect of us today? And the answer is exactly the same as what he expected of us 33 years ago. He expects us to believe in him. He expects us to love him more than we love the world around us. He expects us to fear him more than we fear other people. He expects us to live lives that are distinct. And that is something that many of us here have promised to do. Young people, you saw the first picture that I showed you, me becoming a member. That's what I promised to do back in 2004. It's what others here who have become members of this congregation have promised to do when they've taken their vows of membership. And maybe some of you who have come into membership, you can remember back to the day when you maybe stood up at the front or you stood in front of the elders and you made promises in front of witnesses. Promises to be distinct. Promises to put God first. And what we're thinking about over the next few weeks is renewing the promises, renewing the commitments that we've already made. And that's something that we see in the Bible from time to time. And we'll see that, I think, perhaps over the next few weeks. We see different moments in history when God's people have already promised that they're going to put God first, but they face new challenges. There are new difficulties that make it more difficult for them to be faithful and to be distinct, and so they renew the commitments that they have made. It's a biblical thing to do. But that brings us back to 1990. And some of you, I'm sure, are wondering, what's he going on about that particular year for? Well, the reason is, our congregation here belongs to a wider church. We've got about 40 sister congregations in different parts of Ireland. And back in 1990, all across the church, we reaffirmed the vows that we had taken. And we restated our commitment to living under the kingship of Jesus Christ. That was in 1990. Obviously, the world is quite a different place today. And obviously, the challenges that we face today are quite different. And that is why our wider church, our denomination, has agreed that the time has come to give all of our members the opportunity to renew the commitments that they have made. Now that's been happening for almost the last year. It began happening last June when the members of Synod, which is the highest court in the church, whenever we met for our annual meeting, we renewed our covenant commitments at that point. And then since then, it's been happening in various different congregations all across Ireland. And we've decided in this congregation, we're going to renew the covenant on the 21st of May. And like I've already said, if you have questions about that, we would be delighted to take those questions. We'd be delighted to try and work through them with you. But on the 21st of May, everybody who has officially become a member of the congregation, everyone who has publicly taken vows of membership will have the opportunity to sign a document of covenant renewal. And the wording of the document, like I said, is out in the hall. But this morning, what I want us to do is to spend a little bit of time going back a bit, going even more basically to the very idea of covenant. And I want us to do that by looking at this covenant that God makes with Abraham in Genesis chapter 17. And we've got 2 points this morning. And the first one, God takes the initiative. God takes the initiative. And we see that God takes the initiative in the very first verse. When Abram was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him. So God came to Abram, not the other way around. Abram didn't come to God, God came to Abram. And if God hadn't come to Abram, well then there would never have been a covenant, because it was God's idea. And we see that, or we see, if you like, God's initiative by the way in which he speaks the whole way through this section. So, for example, verse 2, I will confirm my covenant between me and you. Verse 5, I have made you a father of many nations. Verse 6, I will make you fruitful. I will make nations of you. Verse 7, I will establish my covenant. Verse 8, the whole land of Canaan, where you are now an alien, I will give to you as an everlasting possession. And it's like a heartbeat, isn't it? Going the whole way through the passage. I will, I will, I will. Because God takes the initiative. God establishes the covenant. And that makes sense whenever you consider what this covenant actually consists of. First of all, it involves descendants. God promises in verse 4 to verse 6 that Abram is going to have so many children and so many grandchildren and so many great-grandchildren that they're actually going to form whole nations. In verse 7, God makes 4 different references to Abraham's descendants. And we want to realise what an incredibly audacious thing this is for God to say, because at this moment in time, Abram has no legitimate children whatsoever. He and Sarah, they've been trying for years and years and years to have a baby, and it's never worked out. And now, notice verse 1. Abram is 99 years old. And so what God promises here is impossible. Or at least it would be impossible if it wasn't for the fact that it's God who promises. God promises descendants. The second promise is hardly any less unlikely, because God promises land. Notice verse 8. The whole land of Canaan, where you are now an alien, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and to your descendants after you. And that's impossible. Abraham is a foreigner. He comes from far away. He doesn't own any land in the land of Canaan. And the wicked nations who currently live there, what are they going to do? Are they going to say, never worry, Abram, sure, we'll give up our land, you can have it, that's okay? Of course not. And so Abram looks around the land, he looks at the wicked people who currently occupy the land, he sees their strongholds, he sees their fortified cities, and you would forgive him for saying, you know what, the very idea of me owning land here, it's pie in the sky. It's never going to happen. It's impossible. Or at least, if it wasn't God, it would be impossible. Third thing to say about the covenant, it lasts forever. Lasts forever. The whole land of Canaan, where you are now an alien, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you. Well, it can hardly be Abraham's idea, can it? Because no mere man could ever be bold enough to come up with an idea like this. A covenant, a promise that is so ironclad that even if you were to get into a time machine and even if you were to go forward 200 million billion years into the future, it would be no closer to its expiration date. Only God could come up with something so audacious. And then a fourth thing. It's personal. It's a personal covenant. Notice that wee phrase in verse 8. I will be their God. Some of you have maybe bought a house at some stage, or you've bought land perhaps to build a house. You've maybe actually looked at a covenant document. That's about the only The only scenario today when I can think of anyway, that the word covenant is really still quite commonly used. Nobody other than a solicitor ever looks at one of those documents and thinks, here, this looks good. No one gets excited by that. That's not what God's talking about here. God is not talking about a boring legal contract. Really, the closest equivalent I can actually think of is a marriage. A man giving himself to his wife. A man saying to his wife, I will be yours. And that's what God's doing here. He's looking at Abraham and he's saying, I'll be yours. The God who is infinite, eternal, and unchangeable, and completely almighty, he looks at Abraham, an ordinary, bog-standard human being, and he says, I'm giving myself to you. I am hitching my name, my reputation on your welfare. That's blasphemy, isn't it? Or at least it would be blasphemy if it wasn't God himself who came up with that. And here's the best bit. This covenant with Abraham, it's not just an account of something that happened way back in the past. If you're trusting in Jesus, well then this is the covenant that God makes with you. He tells us in this passage it lasts forever. He tells us as well in this passage that the covenant is for Abraham and for his descendants after him. And the New Testament makes clear to us that Abraham's descendants aren't simply those who share Abraham's DNA. It's those who share his faith. Abraham was trusting in the covenant, or more to the point, he was trusting in the great mediator of the covenant. And the New Testament tells us that the mediator of the covenant is Jesus Christ. And that's why, for example, in John's Gospel, Jesus says, Abraham rejoiced to see my day. And that means this morning, if you are trusting in the great mediator of the covenant, if you are trusting in the Lord Jesus Christ, if you are, spiritually speaking, a son or a daughter of Abraham, you are included in this covenant every bit as much as he was. And as we think of all the blessings we have in the covenant, forgiveness and help and strength and hope and encouragement and everlasting life, we want to remember the only reason we have those is because God took the initiative. It's not our idea. It's not Abraham's idea. It's God's idea. God takes the initiative. Second thing, we make a response to the covenant. We make a response to the covenant. Now run your eye down from verse 1 to verse 8, and then notice that there's a change of tone in verse 9. In verses 1 to 8, God He's been telling Abraham all the things he's going to do for him, all the things he's going to do for his descendants. And now verse 9, as for you. As for you. So what is Abraham to do? What is his responsibility when it comes to the covenant? Well, we see it in verse 10. He's to be circumcised. And he is to circumcise his sons. And as we've seen different times in the past, the New Testament equivalent of circumcision is baptism. Now, I want to say two things about circumcision. First one is this. It's an act of faith. It's an act of faith. Circumcision is the way in which Abraham is able to say, I believe the promises that God has given me in the first 8 verses. I believe God when he says he's going to make nations out of my family line. I believe God when he says that from my family he's going to send one who's going to bless the nations. I believe God whenever he says that he's going to bless my descendants with land. I believe that even though these things would be impossible to anybody else, that they are possible for God. It's an act of faith. And if you have taken vows, and if you have become a member of this church, or actually, if you've become a member of any church, you have declared that you believe those promises as well. It's a mark of faith. But the second thing, circumcision was a mark of distinctiveness. It's a mark of distinctiveness. Wonder, as you've been reading the Old Testament, have you ever noticed that sometimes the Jews call the Gentiles the uncircumcised? This sign wasn't just a small thing. The sign of circumcision marked out the difference between those who were inside the covenant and those who were outside. And if we are inside the covenant today, we are to be distinct. And whenever we take vows of membership, that's something we promise to do. We promise to live distinct lives. In this church, we promise that we'll treat the Sabbath differently. We promise that we will treat Sunday or the Sabbath day as more than just another day, more than just a day for shopping or recreation or sport or catching up with unnecessary work. We promise that we're not going to get sucked into the world of online porn. We promise that we're not going to consider our money to be mine and mine alone, but we're going to use it, and we're going to use our time, and we're going to use our influence, and we're going to use whatever God has given us with a focus on the kingdom. We promise that we're not going to get sucked into the ideologies of the day, whether that's about sexuality or gender or abortion or whatever it might be. We promise that we will do our very best in God's strength to live lives that are distinct, to have marriages that are distinct, to raise families that are distinct, and to run our business affairs in a way that's distinct. That's something we've promised to do. And in 2 weeks' time, when it comes to renewing the covenant, it's a chance for us to say, I still have faith in God's promises, and I am still committed to living distinctly. And so whenever it comes to the opportunity in a few weeks to recommit, I want us to remember as a starting point what we see in Genesis 17. God takes the initiative and we respond. As we finish, I want to point out two implications of what we've seen this morning for what we're going to do in a few weeks' time. First one's this. We're not twisting God's arm. We're not twisting God's arm. That's not what we're doing. We're not having a service of covenant renewal so that we can persuade God to give us more blessing. God's already promised us all the blessing in the world. We're simply responding to the promises that God has already made with faith and obedience. But the second implication, whenever we feel overwhelmed, and believe me, you may feel overwhelmed in 2 weeks' time. Whenever you hear Mark reading out the words of the covenant renewal out loud, and you think to yourself, how can I ever live up to this? How can I ever live in the way that I'm promising to live? What do? We remember that God took the initiative. We remember that the same God who took the initiative in making this covenant, he sent the Lord Jesus to be the mediator of the covenant. And we remember that if he has done that, he'll surely give us all the grace we need to keep our obligations. So in 2 weeks' time, if you have the opportunity to sign the covenant renewal document, don't be afraid, but rejoice in the God who richly provides for his covenant people. The God who promises to give you all the grace that you need to remain faithful to the covenant.